Highguard is officially shutting down. The studio confirmed that servers will permanently go offline on March 12th, just 45 days after launch. Survived a little bit longer than Concord, but it is, in fact, Concord 2.0. The route is very similar. Before that happens, one final update is coming that adds a new warden, a new weapon, account level progression, and skill trees. And after that, it's over. It's done. By the time it closes, Highguard will have lived for barely a month and a half. And what does this mean? So here's what makes the story fascinating. According to the developers, more than 2 million players stepped into Highguard's world. On Steam alone, the game peaked at nearly 100,000 concurrent players on launch day. That's not a small showing. That's massive early visibility. And many developers out there would sell their left leg for that sort of player acknowledgement. The issue wasn't that nobody tried it. The issue was retention. Within weeks, player counts fell dramatically. Steam numbers dropped from tens of thousands to the low hundreds. And that kind of decline is devastating for a live service game built around ongoing engagement and, of course, monetization. The studio's official reasoning was clear. They weren't able to build a sustainable player base to support the game long term. And this is where we have issues. With a game built for live service that definitely wasn't prepped for the post-launch situation to be able to at least survive that potential slow burn that some games suffer. It's clear that these games are just not being prepped properly for life after launch in terms of the monetary supply. And that goes on to the Tencent factor. Another major piece of the puzzle came from reporting by Stephen Totillo at Gamefile, who revealed that Tencent was backing the project financially. That's significant because the studio, Wildlight, had publicly framed itself as a new independent team formed by veterans, including former talent from Respawn Entertainment, obviously the studio behind Apex Legends. The reality was that this wasn't a scrappy indie experiment. It had funding from the largest gaming company in the world. Reports indicate that once the game failed to hit certain performance targets, Tencent pulled funding, staff were laid off, and shortly after, the shutdown announcement followed. Even with major backing, Highguard couldn't survive. A deeper look at what went wrong came from reporting by Jason Schreier at Bloomberg. According to that report, several former developers described the situation with one word: hubris. There was reportedly belief among leadership that they could replicate the success of Apex Legends, that lightning could strike twice without fully adapting to how much the market had changed. The live service landscape today is dramatically more competitive than it was in 2019. The game also didn't undergo wide public testing before launch, limiting early player feedback that might have shaped adjustments ahead of release. In short, expectations were enormous. The results didn't match. And this is where we keep repeating this situation of developers just not seeming to understand what players want and expecting their ideas to succeed because they believe that's what players want. This is where the disconnect fundamentally comes from. And it's not just with developers and modern game studios, it's the media as well. One of the more controversial parts of Highguard's life cycle wasn't just the game itself, it was the surrounding narrative. After launch, some gaming outlets and commentators argued that players hadn't given the game a fair shot, which, when you look at the numbers that it received on Steam, that's not exactly true. An opinion piece at PC Gamer titled "Highguard Deserves a Chance, so Don't Kill It Out of Spite" suggested early hostility and negative momentum may have unfairly shaped its reputation. There was early hostility, but for good reason. That framing didn't sit well with a lot of players. The pushback was simple. Over 2 million people tried the game. Many completed the tutorial. Internal stats shared by the studio showed an average session time of 91 minutes. That suggests players weren't instantly bouncing off without engagement. They were playing and then choosing not to stay. To many in the community, the idea that gamers were somehow responsible for the failure felt misplaced. In a market where players already invest heavily in one or two live service games, unless you're a gacha gamer, convincing them to switch requires something exceptional, not just something simply functional. This tension highlighted a growing disconnect between segments of the gaming press and parts of the player base. When a product struggles, Is it because consumers are unfair, or because the product didn't resonate strongly enough with the player base? We're in a space where developers and the press think they are owed something by the player base, that even if the product is not worthy to be played, that it should be played and accepted as such. We have a space that is the indie space that creates unique, individual, crafted games from the heart, and sometimes those do exceptionally well because that resonates with the player base, and sometimes it doesn't. And there is a space for games out there to be made by the person who wants to create art, and for them to commercially fail also. But sometimes too many developers and parts of the media now expect players to accept something that they don't want, and if they don't accept it, it's somehow activism or a political opinion that's creating such a space, rather than the game just not hitting with the consumers. Because at the end of the day, they are trying to sell a product to the consumer and expecting the consumer to want it, at the same time creating something for themselves rather than the actual consumer. And herein lies the disconnect, where we have developers now making a product for themselves but expecting it to be eaten up like it's for the wider audience. Sometimes that works because the products that's created is amazing, and sometimes it doesn't. You can't blame the consumer for the product not living up to the consumer's ideals. And in Highguard's case, the numbers suggest people showed up, they just didn't stick around. Former PlayStation executive Sean Layden spoke recently with Kiwi Talks about the live service landscape, explaining that there's a hard limit to how many of these games can succeed at the same time. Players don't juggle 5 or 6 live service games simultaneously, unless you're a gacha gamer. Most invest deeply in 1 or 2, which is true. That creates a massive barrier for new entrants. The sunk cost fallacy and sunk time fallacy. It's not enough to launch something good. It has to be good enough to pull players away from what they've already committed to. That switching cost is enormous. Highguard entered a market crowded with established giants. Without explosive retention, the math becomes unforgiving. If concurrency trends downward sharply, projections quickly show whether continued investment makes sense. And in this case, it clearly didn't. So what does this mean going forward? Highguard had veteran developers, major financial backing, a prime reveal slot at the Game Awards, millions of launch players, significant positive press coverage, and it still lasted only 45 days. That sends a clear message about the current state of the live service market. Early visibility is not enough. Funding is not enough. Brand pedigree is not enough. Retention is everything. As more studios analyse cases like this, it's likely we'll see fewer high-risk live service bets and more focus on safer, more contained projects. The cost of chasing the next breakout multiplayer phenomenon is enormous, and the odds are getting worse. On March 12th, Highguard servers go offline, and it becomes another case study in just how difficult it is to break into the modern live service games arena. With every apparent advantage on your side, it can still end in disaster.